There's a link in the chat which opens up the agenda for today, and it also includes the summary minutes from before. And let me just pull it up on screen here in case you aren't able to access it on your computer. I think the goal for today's conversation was to very briefly just give a quick update on the user interface design and the workflows and forms, and then spend the most of today talking about the technical architecture, specifically focusing in on the question about if there are specific technical features that we need to think about incorporating in OpenMRS flow, and specifically picking up where we ended at the end of last week, where we asked, what would it look like if we went, quote, all in on FHIR, and kind of at least begin that discussion around how we might be able to incorporate it. So any particular amendments or things people want to add in which they don't see on the agenda currently? All right, seeing none, let's move on. The very first one, talking about the user interface design. I'm still working on this component library, trying to split out the different widgets which we need to be able to drag into the user interface. I think there's a lot of interest, as we saw on the talk thread, which goes back to 2018, where we were looking at trying to create a component toolkit. So I think this is in many ways in line with the work that Medic Mobile has done with their community health toolkit. And there's a lot of groups which are looking to try to, I think, collaborate, even if they aren't able to collaborate on the technical side, to collaborate on the user interface side. And so we're currently setting up a call with Dalberg, with Jennifer, and she'll let us know when that call is available. And one of the documents on the OpenMRS flow folder is begin this document on best practices for EHR design, where essentially I'm trying to go through and collect every book or paper or website where people have articulated guidelines around user interface design. And then once we have this list of resources, we can kind of crosswalk it so that we can, for instance, extract from these resources everywhere that people have published on how to style an allergy alert. And then think about when we design our component in OpenMRS Flow, being able to use these best practices. I think the next on the agenda is workflow and forms, but maybe I'll just pause for any other comments on user interface design theme. All right, we'll move on. Is Tobin around yet? I think he might have been delayed getting on the call. I don't see him, so if he joins, he can comment in later, but he spent a lot of this week trying to look at how FHIR currently manages workflows, trying to understand what we would need to do to be able to map the way OpenMRS handles workflows with FHIR. So when Tobin joins perhaps next week, he'll be able to bring us up to speed on that. And why don't we then move into the third part of that meeting summary, where it's discussing the technical architecture. The very first point under 4A was looking at the community health toolkit. And there is a meeting pending with Medic Mobile where we can talk with their technical team and ask specific questions. The date for that still is pending. And then I guess we get into the actual content for today, which I think one conversation we could either start with would be, what does it look like if we went all in on OpenMRS FHIR? And then the other question would be, what technical features should be in OpenMRS Flow? The technical feature document, if you open it up, has a few ideas sketched out in there. And the FHIR document has a few ideas, as well as a specific example, which maybe we could start the conversation off with. But if you and so that's under, if you open up the minutes to the document under 4C, what would it look like if we all went in on FHIR? You'll see that at the bottom of that document, there's an example. And here it shows how we could develop a user interface component that used a standard user interface, and then it had potential settings that you could set in the preferences, such as if this panel shows active, inactive, or all, whether you just use that panel to show all, whether you had the ability to edit medications based on this panel, or if that feature is turned off. And then this specific user interface component would request its data to be populated using FHIR resources. So in this case, you might use a FHIR list resource for current medications, which then might target medication resources and medication statements. And the theoretical advantage of this would be that these components then would be reusable with different groups which theoretically might have different databases. And ultimately, there would need to be some sort of a layer which would convert between this client-side database, which was operating in FHIR, and a legacy database, which might be operating, for instance, OpenMRS. But perhaps over time, new resources could be added in parallel to the OpenMRS database that would reduce the need for the interoperability between more of this client-side database and more of the the server side or the official database. But this is just, I think, an early sketch, and why don't we open it up here for anyone to jump in.
So you want to start on talking about FHIR?
If you want, yeah, I think, Burke, I think that might be more of an interesting one. Yeah.
I mean, I think there's no doubt strategically we want to work toward FHIR in terms of the model we're doing, and any design decisions, any steps we take nowadays, the first question is, how has that been modeled in FHIR? How does that work in FHIR? Because the last thing we want to do is be creating changes or features that are orthogonal or incompatible with FHIR, since that's becoming the standard way that clinical systems communicate. So I'm a little bit I think to the extent the further we can go toward FHIR, probably the better, both in terms of interoperability and reusability. The things that I'm a little skeptical or hesitant on is creating something that is pure FHIR, that ends up taking 4 times as long to create and isn't immediately useful to anybody because it's so generic that it's not solving any use case, like immediate use cases. And so, I mean, staying grounded in terms of what functionality we have is probably one hesitation. Is just, the goal, let's get what we need to get done. And then to the extent we leverage FHIR or embrace the FHIR standard to do that, that's fine. Then the second part is that I think our experience has been that there is a gap between the real world needs and what we need for an EMR and what is currently working in FHIR or what FHIR provides, and that gap is closing over time and probably will eventually be fully closed, but we're not quite there yet. And when we're using FHIR for things today, at least at Regenstrief, we're using it for some things, and then there's parts where we have to make extensions or make adaptations. There's also you have to be a little mindful of those things that are still a little immature or not fully matured in FHIR. So, I mean, given those hesitations, I still think the extent to which we can embrace and model ourselves around FHIR, the better off we are. I would think for OpenMRS Flow, it's kind of an automatic given that we need to have OpenMRS. OpenMRS, if we're going to build things against FHIR, we need to be able to work against the OpenMRS API. And OpenMRS does have a FHIR module that we've been investing in, and has a fair amount of functionality, but that would probably need to get refactored or rebuilt as needed to support the functionality. Anyway, I'll stop talking because I can rant for a while.
Hi, this is Isaac here. That's really helpful, and I would just second something Burke said. I was recently revisiting Joel Spolsky's piece on things you should never do, and his thing you should never do is rewrite from scratch, and he makes a pretty good case for that. So the idea of FHIR being like very clear as a goal, but very gradual as an implementation effort just makes a lot of sense to me. And one of my big questions has been like thinking about implementing OpenMRS and the Community Health Toolkit together. Should we be working on primarily the OpenMRS FHIR API? And maybe it does need to be refactored and improved as we go, but should we just start with that goal? We used the OpenMRS REST API for the hackathon, but I'd be interested in people's thoughts about that.
Yeah, like for an example would be Sync, and when Soul Develop began working on Sync 2.0, we said use FHIR first. If you're going to synchronize things, leverage the FHIR API, but we also found as they started getting down the road, there were some things that were relatively straightforward to sync within FHIR, and there were some things where there were gaps, and they had to turn to the bespoke REST API to synchronize things. And I think that having an approach where we say it's FHIR first, and that's what we want to be building against, but not let that become a blocker to say, if we can't do it with FHIR, we can't do it, but rather, either we adapt to build up the functionality for FHIR, or if either FHIR, the functionality or what we need to do is missing in FHIR, or it's immature in FHIR and changing too quickly, or it just can't be done through the FHIR API that OpenMRS exposes, then and we don't have the bandwidth to fix that right now, then we use OpenMRS REST API, and with the intent to refactor that to FHIR over time.
That makes sense to me, because then you also end up with really detailed functional requirements for like what to do next on the FHIR API.
Has anyone else on the call actually worked with the FHIR API recently? Daniel or Juliet or Irene? Or Cynthia, any work going on with it in the current ref app releases?
I know that we bundle the file API module actually, but there's not been much activity on it as of late.
Yeah, this is that chicken and the egg conundrum, which I saw a dad joke recently that said, somebody tweeted, "I've ordered a chicken and an egg from Amazon. I'll let you know." But part of the reason that there's not a lot of folks developing against FHIR in the OpenMRS community is because there isn't a FHIR API that's fully. I mean, there is a FHIR API, but it's not, the use cases aren't there. There's not people like saying, "Hey, we have to use FHIR API," and the question is, well, do you build out the FHIR API and then like encourage people to use it, or do you get people that are like hungry to use it and then you're building to their needs? And I think part of the challenge for the community is that it's, people are just trying to get their job done, and they're not saying, I need to do this in a, standardized way that I can use it, in a bunch of different places. We have, I think, funders wanting that need of saying, we want to build functionality that we can use, that we can, use in multiple places. But right now, I think the challenge is that we don't have, implementations that are saying, hey, we're going to do this in FHIR, and so getting developers to develop in that. And on the other end, we're not, like one of the comments I remember, like Saptarshi said a while ago, is like, why don't you just, focus on and put all your effort toward the FHIR API, and then force people to use it. And it's like, well, I mean, that's one way to go, but it's also a way, if you make things completely, backwards incompatible, you could also destroy any chance of having a community. So I don't know. I think we're in a place where we need to be opinionated and be pushing ourselves to FHIR. And the way I've approached that so far is just to say, let's make sure we're strategically pushing FHIR in terms of what we provide as a community, and that anything we're creating or doing is aligning with FHIR. But we haven't had this type of opportunity yet to say we're going to create some functionality that's new. Well, I guess we have with Sync, and we did that to some extent. So this is probably the second example of a project where we have the opportunity to say, hey, should we be doing this against FHIR? And if so, let's leverage the FHIR API and start putting more essentially needs, community needs around that FHIR API being robust and maintained.
I see Mike Johnson's on the call. Any leads that you've seen on the data evaluation side, as far as either DHIS or any other reporting agencies, where having FHIR would be of help for implementations, or what are they using these days?
It's almost like I set you up to ask me that question. Can you hear me okay, everyone?
Yeah, it's great to have you here.
Yeah.
Okay, great. So I just got back from a conference in DC about DHIS2. It was a 2-day conference hosted by BAO Systems, and they're the large consulting firm that hosts and manages the platform behind a lot of the Ministry of Health and NGO DHIS2 systems. And one of the main plenary sessions was about the use of FHIR for integrating between EMR systems like OpenMRS and Omni, and then the DHIS2 tracker, which is the individual patient level longitudinal data store within DHIS2. And so there's not a lot of people using it yet. There was one group, I believe it was PSI Zimbabwe, that has built together with ThoughtWorks an integration between Bomni and the DHIS2 tracker, so that new patients which are created in Bomni are also stored in tracker in the DHIS2 server. But the idea that was discussed at the conference was that a lot of people realize that the future of getting more use out of these health management information systems at the ministry level will be trying to get more and more individual level data into them. And no one really has figured out exactly how to do that, but a lot of people are talking about it. So that's kind of the update on our side there. The DHIS2 developers in Norway have developed some sort of proof of concept using FHIR, but I didn't catch the link for it, so I'll try and find that. And then there's this other initiative called e-registries, which is using the DHIS2 tracker as a longitudinal patient record for a number of different clinical areas. And so one of the leaders of that initiative, his name is Mike Frost, and he basically said for a long time he tried not to refer to tracker as an EMR, but now he just went ahead and said, if you want to call it an EMR, fine, it's an EMR. But then he went into describing kind of the roadmap for that platform. So I think we talked afterwards a little bit about whether there's, he doesn't want OpenMRS to view tracker as like a competitive product, but that each product has a different role to play in the ecosystem. And so he's interested in furthering up discussions on that.
Yeah, from my perspective, Tracker is like, it would be silly and major scope creep to say Tracker's in EMR. That there's great value though in saying if you have an EMR like OpenMRS and you want to get patient level data into, which is typically a subset of patient level data, into Tracker so that you can then do the reports on it. It makes total sense as a model for that approach. So I don't feel threatened in the least by Tracker, from the sense of, to me, it's great to have something like Tracker so that the effort can be, here's the subset of data from the EMR we want to get over into Tracker so that you can do whatever reports you want, and at a granular level and cut them all different ways, versus saying, oh, over in the EMR we have to now start creating summary reports or things that we can send, and we start doing the job of what a tool like DHIS should be doing in the EMR. And so to me, I see Tracker as, like, when I view it as taking a subset of important data elements from the EMR and getting them over to a reporting tool, that model makes total sense.
Yeah, and I think that's exactly what I'm not sure exactly what their vision is for it, but I think that they're tired of having people have arguments about whether it is or isn't an EMR. And so I think he was sort of joking when he just said, fine, you can call it what you want, but this is how we're planning on using it. And he shared a couple different examples of how they're using Tracker in Palestine for a large scale project that's maternal child health focused, and it includes SMS messaging to remind mothers to come for appointments for prenatal checkups and things like that. So, I mean, I think they would like to see a lot more partnership with the OpenMRS community to see how we can work more collaboratively together. And so that was exciting to hear.
Mike, did you happen to see anyone with a large pot of money that they were carrying around specifically for projects expanding FHIR API integrations for open source EHRs?
No, there was not really anyone volunteering to invest. But another conversation that was going on at the conference was about how USAID is about to be ready to release their digital health vision, and they're really pushing more and more toward aligning funding mechanisms to actually support what would be needed for integration between systems. But as far as how that will actually be implemented and what it would look like to get dedicated USAID funding for integration, that none of that has actually been scoped out yet. But that was the keynote address, was from someone from USAID, from the digital health team, talking about the future of aligning investment from donors along the lines of what we actually need in order to facilitate integration. And unfortunately, there's no real opportunity to provide comment yet into that digital health vision because it's still private. But when they release it publicly, then I think there'll be some sort of comment period to provide input on that.
A side note on that front, the World Health Organization is currently soliciting feedback on their new digital health strategy. And so I would encourage any of you all to send them your input as well. The Medic Mobile team definitely will be.
Could you post the link to that in the chat? Thanks, Isaac.
Totally will do.
So I think it's pretty clear from everyone on this call, at least, that there's strong interest that we need a FHIR first approach, that FHIR, both as a API structure and FHIR as much as it can support as a database structure, is kind of a clear long-term goal. But this is going to be, a gradual implementation, and not an implementation which is going to slow down the development of higher priority areas, such as the development of a front-end user interface for OpenMRS. I guess as far as specific next steps around this, I know this is kind of what Tobin's project is this month, is he's trying to become a lot more acquainted with FHIR. Are there specific people we should be trying to engage in this conversation at this point who might be able to steer us towards what might be high value things from the FHIR resources, which are reasonably well developed, that we should look at integrating into our API? And then we might be able to think about what type of elements there the Medic Mobile team might be interested in building, or potentially other implementers like PIH or AMPath, because they have specific needs for accessing that information out of the OpenMRS API. Anyone come to mind, Burke, who might be able to help us with these conversations?
You mean other than Tobin? Yeah, I guess it's there's a handful of folks who have the can do that kind of walk from the OpenMRS domain to FHIR. In my mind, it's less about figuring out what FHIR resources we can use and more about what are the specific use cases and needs, functionality wise, that we need to support. What are those priorities? And then looking first to, can we use FHIR resources to do that? And if not, can we make sure we approach this in a kind of a FHIR compatible way? And that's, there's not like right now someone who's like, I see as like owning and driving the space of FHIR and OpenMRS, or FHIR use in OpenMRS. In the past, I would say that was like, perhaps like Saranga and Suthagar that were like developing the FHIR module, but they're not driving that now. So, but there's certainly people in the FHIR community that would be helpful resources. Like there's a guy named Graham Grieve that knows a lot about FHIR.
Sounds good. I think we could switch over to talking more about the tech features in OpenMRS Flow more generally, unless there's any other comments people want to add in on the FHIR front now.
There was a presentation at the DHIS2 summit by James Agnew that a number of people were kind of talking about. I'll share a link in the chat if anyone's interested.
Great, thank you. Yeah, that's something that Tobin's finding, is that there's not a great single repository of training materials if you want to bring yourself up to speed on FHIR. So any links would be quite helpful.
Oh, interesting. So, usually I just go straight to the documentation. But you're talking about like something that's just a more general getting to know what FHIR is or how it works, or.
Yeah, I think my understanding is, and I've tried this myself, is if you're using the documentation in conjunction with a kind of dummy FHIR database where you're actually playing around with the data model and trying to make it work, I think it's a lot easier to get up to speed. But if you don't have the second half of an actual FHIR database, like running in JavaScript or Python or some other version of it, it's a bit abstract to try to see how the different resources relate to each other, and when you would use one versus when you would use the other one.
Yeah, I guess that's fair. Yeah, I don't have. There was a resource that I ran into when I was doing a deep dive on FHIR before. I'll see if I can. I'll see if I can find it.
Perfect, thank you. And Jonathan too was going to check with InterSystems if they have some public resources they can share. They've done quite a lot of public training in FHIR. So I guess for the next half of the hour, maybe the conversation could go to the other document listed in 4B, and that's the document, What Technical Features Should Be in OpenMRS Flow. And the purpose of this document is to try to identify specific things that this app we're trying to build needs to have inside of it, more from a technical understanding. Which things which we would just want to completely side table because it's too ambitious for now, and the areas of contention which we don't really have a clear vision on, which we might need to kind of debate out between the different groups planning on collaborating on its development. So if you're able to pop that document open, you'll notice that some of the areas of uncertainty were specifically around what JavaScript framework to use. Does single SPA work, meaning you're allowed to actually code in multiple frameworks? Does it need to be cross-browser compatible? And then how much FHIR should we adopt in it? And then you'll see under the must-have features, there's things such as responsive design working across mobile, tablet, and desktop. There's the ability for it to work in an offline state, meaning able to enter data and to view data while not being connected to a central server. And under developer operations, it needs to be able to host the instance in the cloud, have some sort of versioning service of these components so that you know when you upgrade them that if you have a breaking change or not, and ideally that you could have some sort of automated QA testing. Perhaps if people want to just throw out ideas of things we should add to this, we can type directly into the document for this next half hour and try to work on some of these areas. Burke, do you want to kick us off here?
So in terms of the requirements, I actually have an email that had some of this discussion going on. Yeah, integrating different code bases is that's probably more single spot specific. Offline first, you've got that mobile centric approach, so progressive app, you've got that. I think the workflow is I think a key thing. So I think there's a lot of interest in tackling the and workflow is a loaded term, but I think it's both the kind of patient, like clinical workflow of the patient. It's people also talk about it in terms of just from the user standpoint, from a session standpoint, the workflow for a session. And then there's also the metadata of like the kind of program workflows, which are I don't know if it's kind of related to patient clinical workflow, but the notion of what content should be is appropriate for a given workflow. So that connection of a given patient or the context maybe is what I'm getting at. So just the system knowing these forms are what matter in this context, so we can show appropriate forms. Let's see. I would say, and this is maybe not called out yet, is just a teacher best practices. Like I think one of the things we'd like to see in OpenMRS Flow is that it's serving as the exemplar. So when people are adding features to it, or maybe going off on another project, that they're learning from how things are done in OpenMRS Flow. Let's see. So So customizability, and is that in here? Yeah, not yet. So I think a key thing that we look for is the ability of someone to come along and say, hey, I need to tweak it this way or that, maybe take over the screen or replace this functionality with my own custom version of that functionality. So previously we did that with things, both by having kind of widgets or libraries of widgets, but that can also be done through extension points. So calling out, like in the functionality, saying, oh, we're going to show a list of meds here. If that that functionality to display the list of meds has a uh, extension point or somewhere you can hook in and say, I want to influence what that list is or how it looks like. Allows for people to take the system, take it, and even if it meets 80% of their need, allows them to fit in that other 20%. So I think being able to run alongside the existing systems is probably a key feature. So this needs to be something that's compatible with Bomni or reference application or existing OpenMRS applications. So whether we do that, as we've kind of been playing with in a single SPA mode, where we're creating a framework in which, that's probably, I think, one of our hopes with this is not just to create a point of care or create a system that can be the direction we want to go in terms of a web framework, but also to be inclusive. And so I think to the level we can probably not only be able to run alongside with, but ideally be able to kind of incorporate. And then that's again leaning a little more to the single SPA approach. But to the extent this effort or what we're building can include that goal of saying, you can not only run alongside, say, Bomni or your system, but you can there's a way you can for the user's experience kind of switch between those two in a relatively seamless manner. So what I'm picturing there is, of course, I got single SPA in my mind, but that approach of saying this application runs within a div, and if someone activates a certain feature or wants to go to a certain functionality, maybe that takes over the top level div, and it feels like you're in the same application. But so I think that goes probably a little more beyond running alongside and actually playing well with other applications. Those are at least so far, some of the key priorities I've seen.
Cool, thank you. Anyone else, Jennifer or Cynthia, things that you've heard from the ref app discussion, which maybe is too big to tackle in kind of the next release of a ref app, but might be something to work on in this longer term flow project?
I think a lot of the things that Berkey shared, and maybe I can just underscore that I'm seeing a lot of interest in letting this work with point of care, that sort of compatibility or customization. I don't know where you want to put it exactly.
Yeah, I echo Jennifer's sentiments as well. Point of care is a really big aspect, and that has a lot of interest garnered from a number of groups. Yeah.
Yeah, I say that, and I do think that that's going to be a bit of a challenge because not every facility is set up or ready for something that's point of care. So I think that'll take some thinking through.
That's true.
Anyone else there? Irene or Juliet or Daniel? Things you're seeing in the implementations that you're working for these days, which are common pain points, especially from the DevOps side?
Daniel, are you speaking on mute?
No, I'm not.
I guess one pointed question then to bring up might be around deployment, specifically the pain points which we have in deploying the current OpenMRS systems versus kind of this new version in OpenMRS Flow. Are there specific things which we need to think about doing differently for this client than the way that the Ref App 2 works?
So I don't know whether this is the right area to discuss it, but one of the things that we had seen and it had been discussed or requested for was some sort of migration path or ability to allow an older version to update easily to the current version of OpenMRS. That this is something that a number of people had been asking for, and we had envisaged that we would, have these conversations in the background as this bigger process is ongoing. But since you've asked, I think this is one of the things that I know that people are really keen and interested to get some functionality on as well.
Do you know specifically what the pain points are that people are currently experiencing that prevent them from upgrading from older versions of OpenMRS?
There are several. Some of them have actually not upgraded from, a legacy application to even 1 point something. Some of them have 1 point something and can't upgrade to 2 for various reasons. One of the, and I speak specifically to one of the use cases, which is Nigeria, where they have a multitude of implementations, but they are all in different versions of OpenMRS. And the idea, what they were trying to do was to have at least I would say about a significant proportion of those sites using one application. And so they've experienced challenges in terms of sometimes it could be the database, sometimes it's the front end. But on the whole, they have raised a lot of blockers trying to just upgrade from one version to the other. It's not really clear how that can be done in a smooth and seamless manner because, basically they are not able to do that. Even we've had other people who have been complaining on the talk, even when it comes to just even implementing or deploying it for the first time. People have experienced very difficult issues when it comes to installing OpenMRS. So the way it's packaged going in, even migrating from one to the other, those are, still areas that need to be polished up or at least harmonized to to be a bit easier for different levels of users.
And those are hairy problems. I mean, they're big problems. You know, when people have multiple servers, often dozens of servers running a version of OpenMRS, and they're trying to link data between all the different servers, and then you say, oh, now it's time to upgrade. It takes a large effort to coordinate that process and pull it off, because you kind of have to, you have to go and make sure you have every site upgraded at the same time. And
yeah, that becomes costly when you're talking about hundreds of sites.
Yeah, I've also talked to some few who are like, it takes a lot of pain to upgrade, but also the upgraded version doesn't have too much to offer.
yeah, you also have to, obviously, you have to have a reason to upgrade. That's a great point.
I feel like we could spend a whole hour talking about migration.
We've spent quite like now, even if I use the example of 2.10, we've been circulating a request for features for now over a month. And just to give you an example, we had only like one response,
but
or two.
That's not so much about ability to upgrade and more about the fact that many folks are running their own bespoke front ends.
Mm-hmm.
That could be true, but also to the point of maybe we are not coming up with attractive features. That was what I was referring to. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, we can make beautiful features, but if it's not a system that people are using, then that's also a challenge. But I agree, it's probably a little bit of both. I think one of the things that probably gets to the kind of requirements we'd want to put on this, or I don't know that it necessarily fits under. Okay, yeah, I guess you do. We do have it there. Is the automated QA testing? I think that probably is a really big point and comes to this issue of upgradability and usability. Is I think having tests in place up front, kind of test-driven development to the extent we can. It's maybe harder in UI development to do that, but I think the ultimate dream in terms of continuous delivery, or at least continuous integration, is to get to where anybody can come and release a new version because you trust that any change, if it passes the test, then the system's functional, and we haven't achieved that level of testing.
If I could share a few things that we've worked on with the Community Health Toolkit, we're facing really similar challenges. And especially we have a few projects where north of 1,000 or a couple thousand users, and upgrades do become more challenging at that point. One consideration is that if you start investing in an offline first approach, you can upgrade your server application while the users are using their software offline. And so in the user experience, they don't notice a difference while the server's updating. And so for most updates for us, there just then comes a point where the end user they're prompted to refresh. And they do. And in Couch Pouch, you replicate application code just like you replicate data. So that's one thing that's helpful there. Another thing we've done a bunch of work on is, over time, we started to have more separation between the core framework and the code that we would write in a customized way for specific implementations. And initially that custom code was like very, very custom. There were no real standards about like, how do you build a reminder task, or if you want a patient profile with certain care cards, what is that going to look like? And it was just JavaScript that was very interdependent. So like it was very hard for one developer to look at another developer's configuration code and understand what they had done. And that was a big, big pain around the time of upgrades and anytime we had like staff turnover. And so transitioning to a state where also the configuration code, like the framework code, is more componentized, and so you're programming with a more declarative style, and you can do version control and unit testing on the stuff that's custom for that implementation. That the sort of nexus of things around quality assurance and ability to do upgrades has helped. It goes a long way. It's still just a really, really hard challenge. I think this is upgrades are one of the harder things that we do for these types of offline complex deployments.
Yeah, thank you. I think there's a lot of good things on this document, and the document's going to remain open. So feel free to keep contributing to it over the week. Send it to your teams. I think some of the group from PIH and AMPATH might be interested in working on this as well. And kind of as we get to the top of the hour here, maybe just a quick review. On the user interface front, in this upcoming week, where calls being set up to talk with one of the design firms which might be interested in collaborating on that project, and we're still continuing to work on the actual specific components. On the workflows and forms perspective, Tobin's continued to research how we might be able to develop workflows using FHIR-based principles, as well as Jonathan Teich is trying to set up a call with Clem McDonald so that he could, or someone from his team at NIH, so we can understand their form builder that they had built, which ingests FHIR schemas and then converts it into forms. And then on the technical architecture side, we're going to continue to try to understand more about the gap between what FHIR components would be useful for organizations. Perhaps Isaac or Medic Mobile might be able to work on a short list of particular API calls, which they don't see that we have in the system, that it might be helpful if were built out. And then we're going to try to get more feedback in this coming week about what technical requirements we need, so that when we have the call in a week or two with the Medic Mobile team about the community health kit, we'll know, as far as a benchmark, what things we're looking for from a technical architecture and how the community health toolkit is able to meet those types of benchmarks or where there might be gaps. Any other last minute addendums?
Sounds great. I'll just add, one more question that came up in some of our brainstorming and Google Docs and stuff the other week was thinking about, it would be helpful if you all could do some thinking about sort of the choices around offline first and how flexible or how optional that is. So generally, if you are supporting the ability to work fully offline, then you have some kind of database, potentially an in-browser database running on the client. And whether that syncs to directly like the OpenMRS FHIR API or the REST API, or whether you have another database running on the server that it syncs to, and then you do server-server integration, I think is kind of an open architectural question that might be worth thinking about.
Yeah, thank you. That's a great question. The extent as far as the offline functionality. Great question. One last thing. Next week is Easter Monday, so we won't have a call. So what time works for people? I think Tuesday is not a good day for Burke. If we're looking at Wednesday, I think there is a design call, or at least I'm on a design call that Tuesday or that Wednesday. Would we be able to do an hour later at this time? Would we be able to do an hour later than the current time on Wednesday for people? That'd be April 17th.
April 7th.
It might get late for some folks.
Oh.
No, well, I mean, I'm on UTC, so it may be okay for me, but I know East Africa, it will now be 10 p.m. Is that the time you're suggesting?
It would be it would start at 8 p.m. and go till 9 p.m. for East Africa.
Oh, okay. Okay, I think that works.
Or alternatively, we could do an hour earlier if that's better for people.
You're saying the hour before the design forum?
Either
'Cause I
or.
think the design forum is from 9 to 10 on the 17th for East.
So the design forum is from 6 UTC to 7 UTC. And then there's a TPM call, which usually happens from 5 p.m. to 6 p.m. But I think, Jennifer, you and I can agree to create that space for others to use it. And then, yeah, we can sort ourselves out. And then that slot is now open. So if we want to use 5 to 6, I think that's also fine. Well, for me, in any case, that's fine.
Just to clarify, Greg, do you mean this Wednesday, the 17th, or next Wednesday, the 24th?
Oh, sorry. Yeah, you're right. I have my dates incorrect. It would have been for next Wednesday, the 24th. Actually, why don't we hold off now on scheduling it, because we might be able to schedule some of the Medic Mobile team in next week. And so we might be able to coordinate with their schedules. So we'll send out a doodle then in the coming days to find a time that works for everyone. But it won't be on the Monday, the 22nd.
That sounds great.
All right.
Well, thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you, too. Bye.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thanks, folks.
Bye.
Bye.